Hello, truth transistors. I'm going to try this again. I keep having problems trying to do this. So what I want to do is respond to Kayse Melone's video called I Escaped Christian Conservative Indoctrination. This is not coming from a place of condemnation or judgment, but in a place of sympathy and understanding, because quite frankly, I'm going to agree with most of what she says, because I am a biblical Christian. I'm not a traditional Christian. And I think that there's a difference there. I think over the years, there was secular philosophy, Greek philosophy, that crept into the church around the 4th or 5th century AD. And some of those traditions, or became traditions, are damaging to the character of God. And she's going to bring up some of that. But so I had a few false starts. So yesterday, I was just about to go on live when I was checking everything, and I noticed that I spelled her name wrong, Malone, on the title. So I had to stop, start over, retitle the thing, make a new live video. And then I got that all right. And then I did a 2-hour video yesterday, only to find out once I finished that the video that I was sharing of her and playing back and then pausing and responding to had no sound. So I wasted 2 hours yesterday. Then I was just about to go on again and something was wrong. I was like on a small corner of the screen and I couldn't figure that out. So I had to stop and start over. So what I want to do real quickly is test the audio before I get going with this review. And we're going to, I'm going to see if my phone works here.
When I was in grade school, I was taught that liberals were my enemy, that God would send these non-believers to hell, and that it was up to me to ensure that the Democratic Party failed in everything it attempted. Because I wasn't just raised in an evangelical Christian church. I was indoctrinated into Christian conservatism. And I was one of the fortunate ones who were able to eventually walk away from it. But this isn't just about my story. We're going to talk about how these religious values uphold authoritarianism in plain sight.
Okay, sound is working.
This is the Kayse Melone Show.
I don't have an admin today, so that was her introduction. I'll just leave it at that and we'll keep going. So I know the audio is working, but for some reason, I'm afraid that once we're done in 2 hours, I'm going to play it back and it, for whatever reason, stops. But that's how it is. We'll try this again.
Welcome back to the Kayse Melone Show. My name is Kayse Melone, and I'm so glad you're here. As many of you know, as I've been building this community, I have talked a lot about being raised in the evangelical Christian church here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I live. For the first 2/3 of my life, I was deep in the belly of evangelical Christianity, and I believed everything they taught me, from speaking in tongues to Christian Zionism. And it has taken a lot of work for me to deconstruct from all of those belief systems.
Okay. The speaking in tongues thing, I'm not sure about. Like, I don't personally speak in tongues, and I know that there's a lot of Christians that do, and I'm not judging them. The Bible talks about it. Some people believe it was just a miracle of people understanding the gospel in all languages when the disciples were preaching. Others believe, well, there is the tongues of angels spoken of in 1 Corinthians 13, and I have to admit, I don't know what that is. I'm not convinced that what a lot of churches do is true tongues, but I'm also not going to judge them. As far as Christian Zionism, I'm completely on board with what she's saying because I'm against Christian Zionism. And I'll just quickly state that in my study of the scripture, I believe that end times Jerusalem is Mystery Babylon. And I get that from Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah and other passages. I even made a video on that, I think, somewhere. but you can look that up. But anyway, yeah, Christian Zionism is based upon a concept of dispensationalism, a tradition. Now, I love the Jewish people, but I also love the Palestinians equally. And so I think that there is this tendency in Christian circles to sort of be hateful towards the enemies of Israel, which I don't think is godly. I think we need to love and spread the gospel to all people. So I will pause. I wanted to pause there and mention that real quickly.
Systems from all of those ideologies that are very harmful, both internally to myself as an individual, convincing myself that I needed to subjugate myself for men, but also on the whole and for the other people I live on this planet with, people who might look differently than me.
Subjugate myself from men. There is some ways that churches have abused, I think, some of the passages. And when there's a passage where Paul says, as it is written in the law, women shall keep silent in the church. Now, I don't know which law that is, and I haven't found it in the Old Testament, so it might be referring to a Roman law or something, not necessarily a biblical law. But but I do think some people abuse some of the concepts about that. There's a difference between submission and abuse, and leadership and control. There's a big difference between those things. And then she mentions people that don't look like you, which in my experience within the church, there's not really, I don't know if she's going into racism here. That's not really an issue. Most Christians I know are not racist, although I do think that that exists in extreme circles, and maybe that was her experience. So we'll keep going.
Or believe differently than me. The belief system I was raised in was so harmful for so many different ways, or for so many different reasons, and I am very vocal about that. I think it is very insidious to raise children in these environments. I'm very outspoken against them. But the reason that I'm talking about this conversation, the reason I'm having these conversations is not just to call out the corruption of the religious right and the Christian conservative cultures that are propagating here in the United States. It's also to speak to the people who are still in those environments, who were raised in those environments like I was, who maybe are questioning, who maybe are ready to walk away from these harmful belief systems, but are kind of concerned too. And for this episode of the Kayse Melone Show today, I want to dive into why it's so important to really take that step and walk away from these environments that are causing so much harm. Because there's something that's really been sitting with me lately, and it's this idea that the culture war in the United States is not the main event. It's not the main thing that is actually at root of all of the issues that is going on. It's the distraction. And that might sound like a bold claim, especially when we're living through headline after headline about, book censorship and anti-trans legislation and attacks on.
So when she talks about the distraction and division, that is definitely true. I think that there is a false left-right paradigm, and that there is an effort through politics, an effort through entertainment, an effort through other means to divide us. And I believe that there is a global conspiracy of Luciferians that have actually crept in and infiltrated churches too. But it happens everywhere, in public schools, in media, entertainment, and they've infiltrated every facet of society, including churches, including other religions. And that is their strategy, is to create these inclusive or exclusive cliques or groups. And then people become, one group against the other. And there's a difference between that and following what one believes is the truth. As in the Bible, it says, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Now, either that is true or it is not. And I don't believe that the gospel is exclusive, like she might suggest here. I think it's inclusive. I think God is inviting every person in, and that's different than being exclusive, where he's like, no, I'm only handpicking certain people. That's another false doctrine that I disagree with, is what is known as Calvinism, where God handpicks people arbitrarily before the foundation of the world to save, as opposed to inviting everyone to freely choose either him or not. And now he created us for that reason, is what we believe. And thus, he doesn't force us to follow him, but that's what he created us for. Now, the other big doctrine that I think is damaging, and she might bring this up, is the concept of eternal conscious torment for the lost. Now, that's what I was taught since I was 6 years old. That's what I believed most of my life. But as I've studied the Bible, I've realized that that's not what it teaches. It teaches that the souls of the lost will die in the lake of fire, be destroyed, death. And either you live forever or you don't. And God's inviting everyone to live forever. But the way to do that is in Christ. And everyone else will, because he gave us life and he will take it away, right? So that's what I believe. There is the, anyway, I just wanted to bring those two things up real quick, because those are two things that I think are damaging. But I believe God is inclusive, and I believe God does not torment people forever and ever, as the traditions say.
Critical race theory. But if you zoom out, what becomes obvious to me is that these so-called moral panics are in fact very serious, but that they are manufactured and engineered distractions. Well, more than that, they are inherent divisions trying to pit people against each other. And they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They're dividing us. They're getting us to fight over symbols and identities and buzzwords, while the people actually hoarding the power and the wealth continue to do so unchecked.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is what I was saying a minute ago, that the people in power are purposely creating these cliques, these groups, to pit people against each other. And I think this is definitely true. So I think civil rights and anti-racism is good. I do think that there are extreme ways of doing that, which causes division and hate, but there's united ways of doing that. I'm a big fan of the message of Martin Luther King Jr. I'm not a big fan of other means of being aggressive and violent to give the point. And I say that with every facet of society, whether it's anti-abortion, like people that break into abortion clinics and shoot up the place. I'm opposed to that. But I'm also for free speech, regardless of what they're protesting or whatever, as long as it's peaceful and done, in a legal way, and not setting buildings on fire, not breaking into the White House, et cetera, or Capitol building. Those kinds of things ruin. And I think those are counterintelligence. I think those are led by people that are controlled opposition. And the majority of people are peaceful protesters, whether it's Black Lives Matter protesters or those who protested the election in 2021, things like that. It doesn't matter if you agree with them or not, if there's peaceful protesters on both sides. But the media, so Fox News, when they were talking about Black Lives Matter, focused on the violence, and they ignored those who were peacefully protesting. They ignored what it was all about. Same thing with the other side, who CNN or other news media would attack would focus on those who broke into the Capitol building and ignore all the peaceful protesters that were there that had nothing to do with the violence, and ignored what they were, protesting about. And people say things like, well, it's not true, so they shouldn't be allowed to do it. Since when is free speech based upon whether it's true or not? Freedom of religion is not based upon whether it's true or not, right? So the freedom is not dependent on whether it is true or not. Freedom is the freedom to speak, the freedom to believe as you want. So whether somebody believes that the election was stolen or not, that is between them. That is their right to believe that. So so I think that I wanted to talk, when it comes to politics, I'm not a Republican. I've never voted for Donald Trump. I'm not a Democrat. I've never voted for Biden or Obama. The one guy running for president that I liked was Ron Paul, and he was like a libertarian constitutionalist. So his philosophy was total freedom for all people to do whatever you want, unless you hurt somebody else or their property. So that is a very simple philosophy, which I think the Bill of Rights is all about. Unfortunately, throughout the history of the country, we've never really lived up to the Bill of Rights. And I think both parties, the Republicans and Democrats, are fighting against our rights in different ways. So that's kind of my little political spiel. And I understand that most conservative Christians are Republicans. They love Donald Trump and all that stuff. I'm just speaking for myself and what I believe is true. And one of the things I'll say, because I forgot to say it earlier, is that I questioned my faith in 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. I was about 30 years old, and I was that close to walking away from the faith. And I decided to take truth seeking as seriously and not let my feelings or emotions guide me. Like, I wanted to walk away from the faith. There was a lot of things I wanted to do with my life that go against biblical standards. But I also knew that sometimes the best thing for us is to do things we don't necessarily want to do, such as exercise, such as eating vegetables, or, and sometimes, like, drug addicts love to do they love to get high, right? And sometimes the right thing, the best thing to do is to stop, and it can be difficult. So it didn't prove anything. It didn't say, okay, I'm just going to be committed to Christianity. No, I wanted to find the evidence. And so I went on this journey of letting the evidence take me where it will. And I have these playlists on my channel called What is Truth? Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, etc. And a lot of the videos on there are not mine. Most of them are other people's videos. So there's documentaries and things about or debates or other things that convinced me that the historical evidence of Scripture, like creation, the flood, the global flood, and dinosaurs living with man, and the resurrection of Jesus. So if you want to check those out, and I think that there is an agenda, not just in churches, but in propaganda in schools that are teaching against truth. And so that's probably where she's going to go as well. But I wanted to give you a little bit of my journey real quick to show you that I'm a free thinker, and I encourage free thinking. I don't encourage anyone to just be locked in and be mind controlled and be, I don't think true education is about, true education is not about being told what to think. And I think that's the problem with public schools. It's even problems in churches where they force people to think whatever their denomination teaches. But then you have real teaching, real education is teaching people how to think, not what to think. And so I might be getting ahead of myself because I already did this yesterday. So I'll try to stay to what she is saying at the moment rather than, yeah.
Because while we're arguing over whether certain people should use certain bathrooms or whether a teacher should be allowed to assign Toni Morrison, billionaires are buying politicians and corporations are writing legislation. And don't get me wrong, those are important issues to tackle, obviously. But in that same vein, my point here is what I'm trying to bring to the discussion is the fact that we're already being distracted from the most fundamental reality of our society, that we're in the middle of a class war.
I'm not sure what she means by a class war. I think that what she's thinking now is exactly what they want us to think. And that is they want us to have the enemies is each other. When in reality, it's these powers that be that have mind controlled and deceived people to thinking that the enemy is each other when it's really those people in high places that control everything, that have all the money. Most people, 90 something percent of people are middle class or poor. And yet we are pitted against each other, right? Or even the upper middle class is kind of, most upper middle class are not controlled either. So I just wanted to state that. But yeah, I don't think the enemy is each other. I think it's people, or actually, I think the real enemy are people or beings, principalities and powers that control those elites. They're Luciferians at the top levels, the Illuminati, Freemasonry, the secret societies are Luciferians. They're not Christians. So I just wanted to state that.
But because the people in power know that class solidarity would be their downfall, they pit us against each other in every other way possible. And they do this through the Christian conservative indoctrination that I was raised in.
They do it in a lot of other ways too. Yes, they have infiltrated churches. That is true. And many mega churches are controlled by the powers that be. And a lot of movements have been started by Freemasons in the churches. And that's a whole different subject. But they also have controlled the public school system. They've controlled the healthcare system. They've controlled the economic system and the money. They've controlled the media. They control the entertainment industry. So it's not just churches. And true Christians and true churches are not controlled by them. They should be controlled by the Bible. I think most, unfortunately, even the good Christians have been deceived, and their thinking has been a little messed up because of what they've been taught about certain things and the traditions that I mentioned earlier. But I think it's important to point out that the deception and control is not just used in the church or infiltration of the church. It is infiltration of every facet of society. So I just wanted to point that out.
They do this by making sure that white evangelical Christians consider everyone else their enemy.
Okay. That might be her experience. I'm not calling her a liar, nothing like that. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I will say is that in my experience, that is not true. There's not this white conservative Christian idea. Like, never in my life was I taught to be racist. In fact, I'm an interracial person myself. My mom is Hispanic, 100% Hispanic. So I'm 50-50 Hispanic and white. And I've been in fellowship with people of all races. There are Christians everywhere. In fact, white people did not even start Christianity. So I don't know where, well, there was the British Israelism, which believes that the true Jews were actually white people, which I think is false. But that was like over maybe 1,000 years after Christ, and then there's the Hebrew roots of the Black Israelites movement. And I believe that the original Christians were Middle Eastern, so they're not white, and it's spread out throughout the whole world. So yes, there is somewhat of a mindset of America being a Christian nation and all that stuff, and maybe in some circles, and maybe even in the racist past of America, that was the mindset, that Christians are white and everybody else is condemned or something. But that is not what the majority of conservative Christians believe now.
That is who has been doing the bidding of those in power all along, evangelical churches. Now, before you get defensive, I'll say what I always say. I'm not here to dehumanize and villainize the everyday believers. I'm here to expose the institution, the belief system itself, the ideology.
Yeah, that is important, and I'm glad she pointed that out, to differentiate between the everyday believers and the institution. And I think that is true across the board. I could point to many things. Freemasonry. Most Freemasons have no clue what's going on at the top level. So it's not Freemasons that are the enemy. It's the top level Freemasons that are the enemy. Same thing with whatever, politicians. There's many politicians, Democrats and Republicans, that are sincere people that want to do what's best, and they may disagree on what that is, but there are also politicians that are corrupt, and so there's a difference, right? So in church, there are wolves in sheep's clothing, as Jesus or the Bible mentions itself. In fact, when Jesus was on earth, his main rebukes were against the religious leaders of that day. Meanwhile, he was very compassionate and merciful to prostitutes and drunkards and tax collectors, which is funny that that's associated with sinners as well.
Because those churches, the ones I grew up in, they were ground zero for this kind of distraction. Again, I was taught that liberals hated America. I was told that gay people were trying to destroy the family. I was told that climate change was a hoax and that public school teachers were brainwashing kids to become communists.
Okay, a lot of that is republicanism, not Christianity. Really, the only two views that anybody who believes in the Bible holds to that are Republican are against gay marriage, morally speaking, and also against abortion. But other than that, I don't know that Christianity has a universal belief on the other things. It has, and like, anyway, but yeah, so I just wanted to state that. The other thing she mentioned, I don't think is churches or Christians necessarily have a strong opinion about as Christians, unless they've gotten lost into republicanism. And personally, I think that there is bad things that Republicans do and some good things. And same thing with Democrats.
I was told to be a self-proclaimed Zionist and to support the statehood of Israel, no matter the genocidal cost. I remember hearing from the pulpit multiple times that voting in a liberal way was the same thing as voting for the devil. Excuse me.
Okay, I wanted to pause, and I'm kind of laughing because my perspective is my own. Okay, I'm not speaking for most of the church. I've never voted for Donald Trump, and since I escaped, and using her words, the left-right paradigm. I used to be a Republican. I used to love Rush Limbaugh, but then I started to wake up to the false left-right paradigm. And actually, my theory on Donald Trump is that he could be the Antichrist. And it started with the Abraham Accords that he led. And he's like the peacemaker, and he's, trying to make America powerful and all this stuff, and he may succeed. So it's kind of funny because if you talk about, she's to talk about a lot of Christians believe that Democrats are the devil. If Donald Trump is the Antichrist, as I think is very likely, then he will be indwelt by the devil, according to the Bible. So I think that there are many Democrats that are well-meaning people, and I don't think that they are the devil. I understand that's how a lot of Christians think. I also disagree with how Christians have a different, if a Republican is president, they're like, we need to pray for our president, right? And God put them there and all this stuff. But when a Democrat is president, a lot of them have the attitude of our country is being judged. It's like a whole different attitude. Now, not all Christians think that way, but I just wanted to state my perspective on this and why it made me laugh when she said that, because I do think that is a deception. I also disagree, as I mentioned before, on Zionism and Christian Zionism and all that stuff. And yes, many churches are pushing that these days.
And what I think is important to understand is that just because, according to the law, religious leaders from a pulpit, pastors from a church pulpit can't openly endorse specific political figures running for office or specific political parties doesn't mean they can't talk about the actual policies, the actual conversations. Okay.
Yeah. Well, some of the things are biblical standards that we believe in as Christians. And so it may be against what culture is pushing now. And I would argue that the power of America is not run by conservative Christianity at all. It's the opposite. It's actually going against conservative Christianity in the culture. So and maybe 50 years ago, we could say that, but not so much now, that conservative Christian values were controlling the nation's culture or whatever. But anyway, I don't know what else I wanted to say there, but we'll keep going.
And the thing is, I didn't hear this in some backwards shack. This isn't a fringe belief. I heard it in the wealthy, polished mega church with Broadway level productions of praise and worship services and like $1 million sound system or something like that. Like there was money involved. Okay.
My problem with the modern churches is that it is a spectator thing. So Christians come in there, they sit down, they watch a show, and they're not really that involved. Now, they can become involved if they wish, but most Christians just go there and they sit down. My ideal church is a house church where there's 15, 20 people that just get together and talk and study the Bible and praise God. That would be my ideal. Now, even in that, you could have a strong personality take charge, but I think that is a problem of human nature that exists in every facet of society. You have nations that have monarchies, and for some reason, it seems that even in America, we are actually pushing more power and asking more from the president, which means the president is becoming more and more powerful over the years. It didn't just start with Donald Trump. It's been going on for over a century, where this ultimate power to the president is increasing as we go, because the American people keep asking the president and the government to take care of our problems. The more we become dependent on the president and the government, the less freedom we have, the more control they have over us. So freedom is tied in with independence, and being able to work on our own problems from the grassroots and not depend on people in power to take care of us. But yes, in human nature, so going back to Israel, there was a period of time when Israel was set up as a nation, they had no king. you look at the book of Judges, and it says something like, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then they wanted to be like other nations and have a king. So they cried out and they asked the prophet Samuel, I believe, to give them a king. And Samuel said, I urge you not to do this. But God ended up giving them a king, and that was a whole different problem. But originally they were set up with a group of judges and priests, and not a monarchy, so to speak. And this is the human nature. For whatever reason, humans want to be in a group with a leader, a charismatic leader that represents them. This is human nature. I don't think this is the way God intends. In fact, in the New Testament, Paul says not to lord over. When he's talking about leadership in the church, he goes, don't lord over the way that, kings and rulers do, but to be as an example to the others. So it is an aspect of human nature, and not just something that happens in the church. I mean, you look at it across the board. A strong personality ends up taking over. People want to follow that person, right? So I just wanted to make that distinction. And I do think that is a problem in churches. It was a bigger problem in the Roman church when the Pope had ultimate power over everything. And when the Protestant churches took over, they sort of minimized that, but within their church, there became this pastor that was became the CEO of the church in many cases. Now, in many other cases, there's accountability that occurs within that system. But I just wanted to point out that that is human nature, and it's not just a church thing.
Emotional manipulation was covered in, bass drums and fog machines and praise music, and it was glossy. It was well funded. It was essentially a propaganda engine that presented itself as wholesome family values.
So the drum machine and all that stuff, there is hypnosis in music. And if you look at like back in the 60s and 70s, there's videos on MK Ultra, mind control, and that kind of a thing. It's something the government has used, which is known. I mean, you can figure that out, although they deny it, but it's true. They've used it in entertainment. They've used it in secular music. They've infiltrated Christian music and Christian churches. So that is a strategy that is actually used by the devil, not by God, using entertainment to manipulate us. That is a strategy that is used in Disney and in Paramount or other production companies, and it has infiltrated the churches as well. So I totally agree with her on that problem with many churches today.
And for the kids growing up inside it, like myself, it was all we knew. But even as a kid, I thought I had a choice. They told me I could choose Jesus. They said I had free will, that it wasn't about good works. It wasn't about how you acted. It was about your faith. And when you're a child and all of your friends, your teachers, your parents, and every adult you trust tells you that questioning God or not having faith in God will send you to hell, that's not really a choice.
Okay. So she brought up hell there, and I mentioned earlier how I don't believe in the traditional view of eternal conscious torment. I believe either you have eternal life if you're in Christ or you don't. And that is an inclusive offer of salvation. It's not exclusive. So the offer is to all people. And God created us to have fellowship with him, and he's not going to force that. So if they don't want to have fellowship with them, then they just won't live forever. So that is my perspective on that. As far as being children and being quote unquote indoctrinated, that is true no matter what household you're brought up in. And oftentimes, if you grow up in another religion, or if you grow up in an atheist household, you're often going to be sheltered in that environment. And so every parent is going to raise their child the way that they believe. Now, here's what I think the problem is. In fact, let me play a little more because I think she mentions this about youth groups here in a second.
That is coercion. That is manipulation. They didn't teach me how to think. They taught me what to think. And they wrapped it up in the language of freedom. And that is the genius of authoritarian systems.
How to think and not what to think. I absolutely agree. That is true across the board. Like I mentioned, the media, the public school system, churches, etc. There's a problem with not educating people and teaching them how to think.
At heart, they don't always use force. Sometimes they use comfort. Sometimes they use belonging. You get community and safety and certainty so long as you never challenge the rules or challenge the belief system. Because if you do, you're not just wrong. You're not just participating in a free marketplace of ideas. You're considered dangerous. You're, more importantly, considered sinful. You'd be a threat to the fabric of the religious community.
Okay. This has happened within churches, for sure. There can be cultish kinds of churches. Let me differentiate between two ideas. Now, there's the extreme of the Crusaders, which is really no different than Islam. If you think about it, people in Islam, in Islamic countries, are killed if they try to leave the faith. So it's not just in Christianity. And there was this period of time where Crusaders were killing people that weren't Christians, which I don't believe is what Jesus taught. In fact, he said, if they reject your message, telling his disciples, if they reject it, just move on. He doesn't say to fight them or anything like that, or to kill them. No, that is not a biblical concept. That is a world concept that infiltrated the church. Now, as far as, it's probably more common now that when somebody leaves the faith from their family, they get shunned a little bit in some cases. Now, that is not the experience I've had in my family. I have a brother that's an agnostic now, and we all get along with him very well. And we have a good relationship with him, and we love him, even though we disagree. So, yes, that what she's explaining is a problem, but not just in churches, across the board.
And that's how they maintain control, not with, like very blunt violence, not with chains, but with shame. And here's the thing. It worked for me. It works because you can't manipulate people unless you give them something to feel or to root for.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about shame and fear and what to root for, or with comfort, whatever she's talking about as manipulating people. I totally agree with that. In fact, what she mentioned before about teaching people how to think instead of what to think, I think that there needs to be more of an effort to teach kids in churches why the Bible is true, and not just to believe it because we told you so. And then when they go off on their own, in fact, I had to do this myself. When I left my household and I became an adult, I had to think for myself. And I had to ask questions. Why do I believe this? Right? Now, some people don't think that deeply about it, and they just kind of stick with what they knew. I wanted what was true, And so if something is true, then it is what is best. And so, yeah.
You can't manufacture allegiance without that emotional tie. But in order to make the distraction of the culture war work, in order to consider gay people and other ethnicities and other religions, before you can consider them your enemy, you need a powerful emotional hook.
So again, I don't think of any of those groups she just mentioned as our enemies. Most Christians do not think of them as our enemies. So yes, there are these extremist groups that are very hateful. I don't think it's so much with ethnicity these days, but I mean, that's never been an issue in the circles I've been in. Racism is not really a thing in my circles. and in most circles. But there are a few fringe groups these days that are still racist. But as far as the gay thing, the homosexuality thing, LGBT and all that, yes, there are hate groups in churches. The one of the worst is the independent fundamental Baptist churches, and the way that they say, you know, they're hopeless, that they're going to hell, whatever, that they can't ever get saved and all this stuff. The circles that I've run in believe that it's a sin, but they don't hate them. And there's a whole difference there. It's one thing to have a belief about a moral standard. It's another thing to hate people. And let me just say it this way. The moral standard I believe in, I do not live up to. In fact, if anybody is honest in the church, they would all say the same thing. It's only liars that say that they live up to, they're good and they don't do anything wrong. Every honest Christian says that they don't live up to the moral standard that we believe the Bible teaches. And that's why we need a savior, right? So I do not hate anybody, even though I believe LGBT stuff is a sin. There's things that I do that's a sin, or struggle with that's a sin, and I'm not here to judge them. I can only look at myself. I can only take the plank out of my own eye without taking, you know, things out of the other eye. So there's a huge difference between hate and having a moral belief system. So I just wanted to differentiate between those two things.
Which is where childhood indoctrination comes into play. I'm going to walk you through, for those of you who weren't raised in this environment, what it was like.
Oh, I wanted to mention something real quick about childhood indoctrination. So she's focused on within the church. I think that there is a problem, and because I believe that consent should not happen until 18, or there's a legal age, which I think is a good idea, right? Children should not be able to consent to something that they don't understand or shouldn't be able to handle yet. At the same token, they shouldn't be able to consent to hormone blockers and transformation surgeries and those kinds of things. I think they should be left as children and just be kids and not be thinking sexually in that regard. And I think that is also a form of mind controlling children and brain controlling children as well that I think is harmful. Now, what adults do, as a libertarian constitutionalist, they should have the freedom to do those things. So I'm not saying that we should ban those things, even though I'm morally against them. I think that, you know, if it's a free country, there's a difference. Just like drinking, there's drinking ages, right? Children, you know, unless they're, you know, there's laws about that. Children cannot buy alcohol, which I think is healthy. So if one parent gives alcohol to their kids and another parent does not, one side could say you are sheltering your kids by not letting them drink alcohol. The other side is saying that you are damaging your kids by giving them alcohol, right? So it's a different mindset between the two. But I think the law is good to have to protect kids from something that they probably shouldn't be doing yet at their age.
Being raised as a Christian conservative at a megachurch in a predominantly evangelical Christian city. Because you don't wake up one day like just believing in Armageddon and rejecting evolution and science, okay? You're primed. You are trained to think this way. You are immersed.
Yeah, I'm glad she brought that up. So, yeah, you're not trained to believe in all those things. I mean, you're not naturally going to believe those things unless you're taught. And I think what maybe she's not thinking about here, and as I stated, because I'm a free thinker, and I think she is too, that she thinks outside of the box. She has escaped what box she was in, what paradigm she was in, and is asking questions and searching outside of where she was. I think what she's not seeing there necessarily is that the same thing is true with evolution, that this is not scientifically proven fact. In fact, I would recommend a documentary called no intelligence allowed. And it's about these many scientists, biologists, professors, qualified people questioned evolution on a scientific basis and considered the possibility of intelligent design, but they would get fired, they would lose their funding money, etc. There's many examples of that. So whoever the powers that be are have control over what is taught, even if there's evidence against it. And because the control mechanism is pushing evolution, that is the only thing allowed to be taught as far as theory of where we came from. And and so maybe you disagree with that, maybe you don't, but hopefully it gets people to think. And the same thing is true in churches, maybe, where they say, well, it's true because the Bible says creation is true. Well, as I looked at science and evidence, I've found that there is evidence for that, but that's a whole different subject. I'm not here to tell people what to think. I'm telling people maybe look at things from all sides, look at all the arguments from every side. Try to actually watch a creation science documentary, not necessarily embracing it and believing it blindly, but at least considering it. And I grew up hearing evolution in school growing up, so I'm very aware of what that is, and I know that side very well.
I'm an atheist now, and I've been watching a lot of atheist content, and one thing that a lot of atheists will say is like, everyone is born an atheist. We are taught religion, right? And this is very indicative of that, all right? Because from purity pledges at youth group to being taught rapture theology in Sunday school, the fear of the world, of reality, is constant. And that is how the immersion works. There's always this sense that the end of the world could happen at any moment. I truly believed that. And that if you weren't right with God, such as, obeying your elders or rejecting anything liberal, you were going to be left behind. And I'm not kidding when I say that I and many other people had recurring nightmares about the rapture.
Okay. Again, speaking from my perspective when I study the Bible on end times, I believe it's true. However, I think what I believe is that there's no pre-tribulation rapture, and I believe that there's going to be a period of time in which the world persecutes Christians. That if you're not bowing down to this image of the beast, and according to the Bible, everyone who is not a true believer in Christ will bow down to this false image. And because of that, those Christians will be persecuted. Now, there will be some people who call themselves Christians that will actually be on the side of the Antichrist. But because of that, so you have to think about it from this way. If you think about during the Great Tribulation, Christians are going to be treated like Jews were in the Holocaust. Okay? If that's the case, judgment will be coming against those who are persecuting them, right? So it's not a fear-mongering thing. It's just something that I believe will happen. But I believe what first happens is Christians are persecuted, and then at the end of that period of time, Christ will return and judge the nations and put an end to that Antichrist system. And in the history of the world, since man fell, Satan has been the god of this world, meaning little g God. He's been in control of the worldly system. And the true God is trying to get us out from that, because the satanic worldly system has always been corrupt. So that's why there's so much corruption in world history and in governments and things. So it'll come to a climax where it's globally evil against God's people. And that's what we believe. That's what I believe. And because of that, they have to be judged for that after that happens.
I remember checking like the closets with, or checking like my house if nobody else was home, or maybe I took a nap and I woke up and they were out running errands, but I didn't know that, and calling my parents just to make sure I hadn't missed the capital C call. It was crazy. And then there was, of course, youth group, which was the bait, right? Like free pizza, video games, Christian rock concerts, even breakdancing shows, like all for Jesus. I'm talking, again, full production value.
Yeah, youth groups. I knew she was bringing this up because I watched this yesterday. I personally think that youth groups need to be taught the biblical evidence and why it's true before they go out into the world, because I believe that it's not a matter of propaganda and it's not a matter of forcing. It's a matter of, if you know something is true, when you hear these outside forces telling you otherwise, you will know how to defend it. You will know how to say, this is why I know it's true. And not just in youth groups having entertainment and saying, well, let's just have fun, just stay in church so that you're not out in a bar or doing drugs or something. Not that kids can go to a bar, but you know what I'm saying? Like, that's kind of their thinking is, well, this is just a safe way to have fun without going out in the world and doing bad things. Unfortunately, that's not preparing them for other belief systems that they're going to encounter as they become adults. And so I think that's a terrible system. Instead, they need to be learning why they believe the Bible is true and what evidence there is for it. So that would be a complaint that I have about the youth group system these days.
With the lights and the bass drums and the dropping the beat, it was honestly like kind of exhilarating. It was emotional. There was a tie to it. And then in the middle of all of that really high intensity performance, they would hit you with sermons about how sex before marriage or sex outside of a heteronormative marriage would ruin your life. And
okay. I believe that there's evidence that that is true. That that God's initial plan was a family with one father, one mother, and children, right? And that this creates an environment that is best for children to raise up in. I think it minimizes crime, it minimizes poverty, it minimizes many things. And when this is more statistical and proven fact that people that wait until marriage have a tendency to have better marriages. People that have sex before marriage tend to have problems in marriage. Now, it's not 100% that these people that had sex before marriage will get divorced, or that these people that waited till marriage will not get divorced. But the success rate is much higher if they wait. And I think that, logically speaking, it makes sense, because if your relationship is about that, it can blind you to other problems in the relationship. If you wait until marriage, you get to know each other better without that, as friends, and finding out if this is somebody you want to spend the rest of your life with. And when two people stay together, it's a healthier environment for children to be raised. As for the LGBT thing, you can't have children. Two people of the same gender can't have kids. So that's not how God created things. And that's why it's not allowed in the Bible. But I do think that it's not just a Christian propaganda machine. It is actually proven in psychology and in real life that it is better for society, it is better for individuals, it's better for children to have these family structures.
And how certain ways to view politics were the only godly choice. Every moment of my upbringing was engineered to be emotionally memorable and therefore manipulative. so that the messaging would stick deeper. Christian schooling, like for myself, because I didn't just go to the school, or I didn't just go to the church on Sundays. I also went to the Bible-based evangelical Christian high school affiliated with that megachurch. And Christian schooling at this form of education added another layer of insulation. We were taught that climate change or environmentalism was basically pagan worship at best, or a complete fabricated host at worst.
So that could go both ways, right? I'm not an environmentalist, or I don't know much about that stuff, but it could also be a propaganda the other way. You could look at it both ways. The question is not who's being, like, are they pushing this environmentalism or pushing anti-environmentalism, or however you want to say that. The question is not who's being pushed, what propaganda is being pushed on people, because both sides you could say the same thing, right? The question is, what is true? Is humankind the reason? Now, I think that there is environmental problems, but I heard a Christian actually talk about what mankind's responsibility is when it comes to nature, because I do think at the very beginning God said that your job is to rule over the plants and the animals and all that stuff. So ruling over doesn't mean enslaving them. It's like being good stewards of the world God gave us. But there is questions of whether the environmentalists are giving messages that are actually good, or if it's a means of control. So there's a difference there, and I'm not smart enough to know, what's what. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up, because environmentalism is not really something that I hear talked about much in churches. Maybe that was something she heard. And sometimes we can conflate republicanism and Christianity, but that's something else. I don't remember. The church I go to has never really brought up environmentalism much.
We were told that Zionism was non-negotiable, that the theory of evolution was literally satanic. We weren't allowed to question scientifically. We weren't allowed to question our pastors or our textbooks. Every lesson came with a prepackaged worldview.
Just something to think about. Are scientists these days allowed to question evolution? So you can look at that both ways, right?
And that worldview was always centered around things like American exceptionalism, because it was a Christian nation, Christian supremacy.
Okay. I wanted to pause real quick, because my personal belief, as I stated before, I think Donald Trump could be the Antichrist. I think Jerusalem could be Mystery Babylon, the great city in which the Antichrist system is the capital is. And also the final beast empire, the final beast, it says, so beasts in prophecy are nations or kingdoms. And the last beast is said to trample over the whole earth. And my view on America is that we have the most widespread military in the history of the world. And we are basically policing the world. Everybody's looking to America to stop wars. Everybody's looking to America to solve the problems of the whole world, right? That's why I think it's possible that the United States is the final beast empire. So I find it funny how most Christians think America is a Christian nation. If it ever was a Christian nation, it hasn't been for over 50 years. Prayer was taken out of the schools in 1962. We haven't been a Christian nation since at least 1962. And before that, many, many people were not Christians either. So anybody who thinks America is a Christian nation isn't paying attention. So that's my perspective on this. I think America today is a humanist, secular nation, and the trend of culture and society is very liberal these days.
and also, of course, patriarchal control. You weren't just learning math or science, you were learning submission, is really my point here. You were learning to distrust the outside world, to distrust secularism or the liberal Hollywood elites.
And then other people are told to distrust Christianity. That goes across the board. Patriarchy and all that stuff, that goes in any facet of society, really.
You were learning that the truth could only come from those who had power in your community.
Yep. So let's take that thought real quick. I'm going to turn this around using the same exact logic, because that is true in churches. That is true. I'm not, disagreeing with that at all. There is a thought about, and this is not a Christian thing, or, has nothing to do with Christianity, because Christians themselves are divided on this. When she talked about those who are in power, let's take the healthcare industry and the whole recent COVID thing, when you had people saying that we need to listen to those who are in power in the medical industry who are telling us these vaccines are good. And if you question that, then you're a bad person, right? Or if you pushed the vaccines, you're also a bad person, depending on which side you're on. So that is an example of people in power telling people what is right and wrong. Just because somebody has a qualified position doesn't mean that they have the best interest of the people. That's true in the churches. That's true in any form of authoritarianism, right?
The reality is there are so many factors that caused my indoctrination as a Christian conservative to be powerful. And again, for people who weren't raised in the evangelical Christian church like I was, it can be hard to understand why today's MAGA supporters are so cult-like. But I have real sympathy for people who are still clinging to the worldview of Christian conservatism, to that environment, because they're hoping that their suffering in this world has some supernatural meaning. That's what they're clinging to. And don't get me wrong, I do think that there's definitely an argument to be made for holding Trump voters accountable for the mess this country is in, okay? For the authoritarianism they voted for. But I think it's a mistake to...
Okay, the authoritarianism of the president has increased gradually over the years. And Trump definitely has the biggest authoritarian personality of any of the presidents I recall. That is definitely true. But the power given to the president has been steadily increasing for over a century. And that is a problem for sure. And now we have somebody who actually has the personality to use that authoritarian power in a way that I don't think we've ever seen before. Although Obama and Biden and Bush and they were all using it, but maybe with a personality of a little bit less take charge attitude. But yeah, definitely it's something that has been increasing, and I think it's very likely that America will eventually become a monarchy.
Look at these misguided votes in every case, every single case, as a sign of someone's internal evil. Of course, there are actual bigots who hate people who aren't exactly like them. I'm not talking about them. But again, I was indoctrinated in this environment. I can promise you there are plenty of Christian conservatives who, while still deserving of our criticism, who are still deserving of our frustration at their stupidity for voting for Trump, are more misguided and afraid than specifically out to pick on the little guy. The reality is it took a lot of work for me to question the belief system I was indoctrinated into. And I'm still trying to navigate how to challenge that belief system, how to get everyday Christian conservatives to question the messages coming out of the pulpit, and how to empower them to change their own minds in this regard. I can guarantee you this, though. I can promise you that the more we feed into the narrative that this is all about Christian conservatives versus everyone else, the more we are playing into the narrative that proves their worldview correct, you're proving them right. The more we are playing into the culture war that the ruling elites want us to fall for.
Yeah, and again, that is true of any facet of society, any belief system. So it's not just the church that's fallen into that mindset. It's a lot of people.
That is what's going on. The thing is, as much as I truly believe that everyone deserves to worship whatever gods they want, I still maintain that I think organized religion as a whole holds societies back from progressive progress and holds individuals back from authentic expression.
Okay. I think that the problem is that the true church has been infiltrated by evil people, and wickedness has crept in to where it's become a control mechanism and part of the problem. But that is true, like I've said before, they have infiltrated every facet of society to control us. And and I will say that true biblical Christianity does lead to progress. Maybe not in the way that you're thinking, but I believe that when America first began, there was a whole lot of true Christians that came here that were not people of power. They left Europe because they didn't have the freedom to believe the way that they thought was biblical or whatever. And the whole culture was based upon freedom, Christian values, not necessarily forcing Christianity, although sometimes they did, unfortunately. But generally speaking, the culture of America was built around, before even the Revolutionary War, I'm talking about a whole century or two before that, where people were coming here in the 16 and 1700s with a mindset of the Christian biblical concepts before it was taken over by Luciferians. And in fact, the founding fathers were Freemasons. They were not, they might have used terminology that made them sound like Christians, but I think that they were actually Freemason, Luciferians that pretended to be Christians. But I think that the wealth and success of America and the freedom was pushed by biblical Christians. It was the Luciferians that were pushing slavery and things of that nature, and also a dependency on government for welfare and all that stuff. The freedom, the idea of freedom is independence and personal responsibility and hard work. I think one of the greatest generations was the World War II generations, the one that grew up in the Great Depression, and they learned hard work. They learned family values, and they created a lot of wealth in the 20th century. Now, some people are going to say, well, that they benefited from FDR and the welfare state. Well, the original intent of the welfare state was to get people out of poverty until they get a job and become independent again. And most people in that culture, in that generation, wanted to get out of welfare as soon as possible by getting their own job and becoming independent. But a generation later, in the 1960s, the baby boomers rebelled against that whole thing and started to abuse the welfare system in the 1960s, and started to seek other religious things. And part of that was because a lot of the Christian culture was dead religion. Even though I think the culture benefited society, they didn't really have, just like people in youth group aren't really taught how to think and why they believe the Bible is true. They're just taught this is good and we'll just entertain you, good, safe, So the same thing was true back then, where you had a whole generation that was living out Christian moral guidelines, but they weren't necessarily rooted in truth. It was more like, this is just the way it is. So their children grew up and rebelled against that. Like, generally speaking, the baby boomers rebelled against their parents. Now, many of them did eventually come back, and I think there was a Christian revolution in the 70s that was counterculture with the homeschool movement, and that I benefited from, that questioned, a lot of things, and house churches and the Jesus people and all that stuff, that was less religious and more real, if that makes sense. Maybe I'm getting sidetracked here, but I forget what else she mentioned there, so I'll just keep going.
And that brings me to the bigger picture here. Organized religion functions as a hierarchical control system. It sells itself as a spiritual guide, but what it's really doing is teaching you how to obey. You're taught that morality comes from authority in these environments, that truth is inherited, not internally discovered, that doubt is dangerous, and that the best thing you can do with your life is to submit to God's will. That is exactly what I was taught over and over again, which conveniently always seemed to line up with the pastor's opinions or certain politicians' policies. And if your questioning doesn't match that doctrine or that policy, it's labeled as rebellion. And when you grow up in such a tight-knit community, you don't really know what life will look like on the other side of that.
Very true. Very true. That is true of any upbringing. Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, even atheists can oftentimes. Now, if a parent grew up in a certain situation and got out of that, they may be a little bit more open with their kids as far as sharing different perspectives and understanding, because they may have relatives that are of a different religion or something. So, yeah. And now I will say that I benefited a bit from my parents, because I didn't ever feel controlled. First of all, my parents were sincere, loving people. And second of all, this is still within the realms of Christianity, but I experienced different denominations growing up. And I remember they put me in a charismatic school when I was in third grade. And my dad was Baptist, and there's some differences there. And I remember one time in chapel, they had an altar call to speak in tongues, and I went up and I spoke in tongues. And I told my parents, they were not mad at me. They were not mad at the church, the school. They were not upset about it. They just said, well, we don't agree with that. And that was one of those things that I learned about, well, number one about them is that they're not emotionally anti. It's more like, there's this bigger world out there. We believe this, but they were just like, that's a little different than what we believe. But it wasn't like they were sheltering me into their Baptist or whatever concept. It was just them telling me what they believed. And I have a sister that buys into the tongues thing, and my parents don't mind that at all. They're not upset at her, even though they don't buy into that themselves.
If your lived experience contradicts the interpretation of scripture of that environment, it's framed in such a way to suggest that your experience is wrong. And I just think that's so dangerous. I was told that I had a personal relationship with Jesus, and this is an argument that a lot of Christians will fall back on, that it's not.
Yeah, I wanted to pause real quick and say, I think that she's giving her true experience. And unfortunately, a lot of the things she experiences is not biblical Christianity. That's my perspective. So I think I completely understand and have sympathy for why she and many people leave the church, because they're given a wrong impression of what the Bible teaches and who Jesus really is.
Not about, the good works that we do, or it's not about the way we vote. It's about having a personal relationship with Jesus. But I still maintain that such a relationship came with a long list of rules and an even longer list of enemies, because it wasn't a relationship. It was institutional loyalty. It was branding. Jesus was the figurehead, but the real power was in the church structure and in the community. And in that, the top of that structure was wealthy, mostly white men who made decisions for the rest of us and called it divine. And they were celebrities in their own right with, designer suits and book deals and all of the things. Like, their word was gospel, and questioning them was seen as heresy, not questioning your lived experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That is an attitude that exists in the church, and and I would only say that not my experience in studying the Bible, because if the Bible is God's word, that would be how I would put that. But also, as she stated, her experience or people's experience. But I think there is a form of gaslighting when it comes to authoritarianism, that people that start to question those authorities get shunned, they get ridiculed, they get rebuked and all that stuff, rather than being told or encouraged to ask questions and to think. And I think that's very important.
Questioning the pulpit. And let's talk numbers for a second, because sometimes data tells a story. According to the Pew Research Center, around 72% of white evangelical Christians still support Donald Trump. And in stark contrast, only about 10% of Black Protestants in this country do. And that's not just a difference in political preference, I would say. I think it's a window into two entirely different lived realities of Christianity in America. White evangelicalism has long been entangled with imperialism, with the project of American nationalism.
I would say republicanism does, and because most Christians are believe gay marriage is a sin and that there should not be, they're pro-life, they vote Republican. As far as all that other stuff, I will agree that republicanism is my favorite politician called them neocons, because there are some neocon fascist things involved, while I would say that on the left, they have their own problems of Marxism and socialism and things that I think is equally as bad. But both of them are problematic. Both of them are controlled by the same hierarchy, just giving two sides of the same coin, basically.
It's a version of Christianity that has often prioritized order over social justice, or hierarchy over liberation, or power over empathy.
So I would like to, I'm going to actually make a part 2, because it stopped raining outside. And the reason I was doing this video now is because I couldn't work. So I need to stop and go to work. But I would argue that true biblical Christians were fighting against slavery from the beginning. If you go back and talk about slavery, I would argue that the concept of evolution increased racism. And that's just logic. And I'll try to explain that. The original title of the book, called Origin of Species, included the advance of races and stuff like that. I can't remember the whole, you can look it up yourself. But the whole concept of evolution suggests that there are humans more evolved than others. But if you look at biblical Christianity, the concept is that everyone is created in the image of God equally. So while some churches and some Christian movements have sort of bought into this idea, or that's crept into it over the years, I would say that the mainline teaching of the Bible is for justice. And Jesus talks about giving money to the widows and to the poor and all that stuff. But it also talks about he who is lazy. In Proverbs, it talks about go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. And then it talks about how hard working the ants are, and those who are lazy end up becoming poor, right? Now, there's other factors to that. In most countries, people are poor not because they're lazy, but because of the corruption of the governments. And I think that there's corruption here too, but there's corruption all over the world. And so there's two different things. Sometimes people are poor because of the corruption of the society. Some people are poor because of their drug addictions, alcoholism, or laziness. So anyway, so when she talks about social justice, I wanted to touch on that real quick. As a libertarian constitutionalist, I believe that adults should have freedom to do whatever they want unless they hurt somebody else or their property. That's different than republicanism, because many Christians say that we need to ban homosexuality altogether. We need to ban all that stuff. I think that because I believe in freedom, I don't believe in forcing people to hold to a Christian value system. And so I think people should be free to be transgender. Now, it's a little different with kids. I think that there are healthy laws to protect children, like when you can buy alcohol or when you can consent to sex, or, those kinds of things. And so I do think that there is a protection for people whose brains have not developed yet. They're still growing up. They haven't become full adults. So that's a little different, but I'm talking about adults now. I'm talking about freedom for adults. People should be free to be Muslim or Christian or atheist or whatever. And unfortunately, there is a movement in conservative Republican Christian circles that are saying we need to ban Islam, we need to ban homosexuality, we need to ban transgenderism. And that's not freedom. That's anti-freedom. Same thing with those who say we need to ban Christianity or whatever. So I'm going to put this on hold. We're at 1838 on this video. And I'm going to do a part 2 later. And my hope is that this is something that will get people to think. I'm not here to push what I think on other people. I'm here to give a unique perspective, I think, because most Christians are probably not, if other Christians have responded to this, it's probably a whole different tone than what I'm giving. But yeah, so I've got to get back to work. So this is part 1, and we can, I'll come back later and do a part 2. All right. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.